So they, so it's like a, so how did you ever find what is their role in society? Kind of like the British one, but the British monarchy is
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Nobel Peace Prize Award 2021 in honor of Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov. David Beasley, the executive director of last year's Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the World Food Programme, will also attend the ceremony and deliver his Nobel lecture. The recent upsurge in the pandemic and the new national corona restrictions imposed this week have made it necessary to drastically scale down this year's Peace Prize events. The Nobel Committee apologizes for any inconveniences this may have caused our invited guests, and especially for disappointing more than 600 people who had been looking forward to be present here today. Let's hope it will be possible to invite a full audience next year. We are about to start. Please remain seated until the ceremony is over. Remember also to mute your mobile phones and other electronic equipment. Enjoy the ceremony, and thank you for your attention.
Ressa Your Majesties, Your Royal Highness, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Food creates community and gives pleasure. Food is our most basic need, but it does, in fact, feed more than our bodies. Most religions command the moral duty to share food, and food is often part of religious rituals. Lack of food is detrimental to our existence, and I maintain that it is a universal duty to ensure that all people are fed. The World Food Programme carries out this duty on behalf of United Nations and on behalf of the international community. The award of the Nobel Peace Prize for 2020 to the World Food Programme, WFP, addresses more issues than the humanitarian aspect of food. In its announcement in 2020, the Norwegian Nobel Committee stated that the WFP was awarded the prize for its efforts to combat hunger, for its contribution to better conditions for peace in conflict-affected areas, and for acting as a driving force in efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon in war and conflicts. Access to food and fair distribution of resources are a defense against social distress and conflict. Starvation is an effect of war and conflict, but may also serve as a weapon to starve out the enemy. Food insecurity and hunger may even create conflict, as war and conflict may cause food insecurity and even famine. The WFP actively intervenes in conflict-ridden areas to prevent these negative consequences. Unfortunately, there is a greater need than ever for the work of the World Food Programme, given the ongoing conflicts in Yemen, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and other conflict-torn areas of the world. The award of the 2020 Peace Prize to the World Food Programme is compliant with the will of Alfred Nobel, as the organization's work fosters fraternity between nations and promotes the abolishment of use of hunger as a weapon of war. I am very happy that the WFP and its director, David Beasley, were finally able to come here to Oslo and deliver the Nobel lecture. But in a moment, because before I call upon Executive Director David Beasley to deliver the Nobel lecture on behalf of the World Food Programme, let us remind ourselves how the diploma and gold medal were presented in Rome exactly a year ago by our representative, Ms. Lisa Clark of the International Peace Institute.
On behalf of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, it is my great honor to present the Nobel Peace Prize for 2020 to the World Food Programme, represented here by Executive Director David Beasley. Mr. Beasley, let me convey to you my warmest congratulations and ask you to come forward to receive the Nobel Medal and diploma on behalf of the World Food Programme.
Thank you. My goodness. A great moment then and a great moment now. On April 10th, 1815, 6,000 miles away from here on an island in Indonesia, a volcano erupted. It sent a massive plume of ash into the air that encircled the entire globe. A year later, 1816, became the year without a summer. Incessant rains fell here in Norway, Britain, China, the United States. It snowed 20 inches in July in Boston. Crops failed, livestock died, people starved, food riots, looting, burning of cities, floods of refugees, epidemics of typhus, and it took decades to recover. Millions died in places just like this, the worst famine of the 19th century. No one saw it coming. With famine, one rarely does until it's too late. But I'm here to say this time, we see it coming clear as day, and it will affect us all unless we act. Your Majesties, Your Royal Highnesses, distinguished members of the Norwegian Nobel Committee and friends from around the world, thank you. As you said in your announcement, we do combat hunger. We do improve conditions for peace in conflict-affected areas. And most of all, we are a driving force in efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict. Well, that's the World Food Program, saving lives and changing lives. Working, assisting over 115 million people in 80 countries day in and day out, the women and the men of WFP, we've gained, as you can imagine, quite a unique perspective. We've learned that there is great richness in those who are seen in the world as the poor. And many of us who are considered rich, well, we are actually poor in the things that matter most. Division is the greatest problem. It is known by many names: brokenness, polarization, alienization, discrimination, hatred, war. And today, division's most stark expression right now is the divide between the wealth, for example, of billionaires who've earned an additional $1.8 trillion during the pandemic, and the hundreds of millions of people who go to bed hungry every night. Allow me to break down the facts of hunger as they stand right now. 811 million people go to bed chronically hungry every single night around the planet. 283 million people are in a hunger crisis. In other words, they're marching toward starvation. And within that, 45 million within 43 countries across the globe are in a hunger emergency. In other words, famine is knocking on their door. Places like Afghanistan, Madagascar, Myanmar, Guatemala, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, Mozambique, Niger, Syria, Mali, Burkina Faso, Somalia, Haiti, and I can go on and on. The world has often experienced famine, but when has it ever been so widespread in so many places at the same time? And why? 3 reasons. First, man-made conflict. Dozens of civil wars and regional conflicts are raging, and hunger has been weaponized to achieve military and political objectives. Second, climate shocks, climate change. Floods, droughts, locusts, and rapidly changing weather patterns have created severe crop failures around the world. Third, COVID-19. The viral pandemic has created a secondary hunger pandemic, which is far worse than the first. Shutdowns have destroyed livelihoods. Shutdowns stopped the movement of food and inflated prices, and the net result is the poor are priced out of survival. The ripple effect of COVID has been devastating on the global economy. During the pandemic, $3.7 trillion of lost income, mostly among the poor of the poor, have been wiped out, while food prices at the same time are rising. The cost of shipping, for example, has risen 300 to 400%. But in places of conflict and low-income countries, it's even worse. For example, in Aleppo, Syria, a war zone that I just returned from, food is now 7 times more expensive than it was just 2 years ago. And even then, they had no money. Can you just imagine how a mother weeps over her children? The combined effect of these three, conflict, climate, COVID, has created an unprecedented perfect storm. Well, what do we do about it? The first thing we need to do is restore our moral compass. The highest standard of humanity has always been the golden rule. It's a part of all religions, all cultures, and it is the foundation of the culture of the World Food Program every single day. I learned it growing up, like many of you as a child, as articulated by Jesus of Nazareth, who said, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you," or "Love your neighbor as yourself." I've learned that a more accurate way to translate this from the ancient Hebrew is, "Love your neighbor as your equal." Imagine seeing my neighbor as my equal. It changes everything. If I love my neighbor as my equal, discrimination, racism, sexism, and every other ism disappears. And to my way of thinking, we are equals because we're all created in the image of God. Each and every one of us is very special, and yet we are equals. Regardless of our religious views or our views on creation, we can all agree on the practical significance of every single person being equal, and most importantly, being treated equally. It had been a very long day in the rubble of war-stricken Yemen, seeing the suffering, the tragedy, the horror of war. And we went to a children's hospital. And as I was walking from room to room, the devastation, one of the particular rooms, a little girl's feet were sticking out of the blanket. I have 2 daughters, and you can imagine, as I thought when they were little, I'm going to walk over there and I'm going to tickle her little feet. She didn't giggle. She didn't smile. She didn't even move. She just stared with empty eyes. It was like tickling a ghost. I went out of the room, slid around the corner, and I wept. Too late. We got there too late. Our failure to see this little girl as our neighbor, our sister, our equal has created all the consequences of her tragic life: war, starvation, and those empty eyes. On her behalf, I must express the urgency of this particular hour, the global threat of famine for millions and millions of our brothers, our sisters, our neighbors, our equals. You heard this fact from me earlier: 45 million people in 43 countries knocking on famine's door, and it is within our power to save every single one of them. They are already desperately hungry, and they are just one weather system, one military maneuver, one price spike, or one supply chain blockage away from being plunged into catastrophe. This is why I have made a one-time emergency appeal for the $6.6 billion from the billionaires of the world. And is that too much to ask from those who have reaped $1.8 trillion more during the pandemic? The good news is that we have proven systems in place at the World Food Program to feed them all. Last year, we reached 115 million children, women, and men, and we averted famine. Well, the bad news, COVID recycled with devastating ripple effects. We're now over $6 billion short of the funds we need to reach everyone who is knocking on famine's door. We just need the funds to scale up to meet the needs of the people. If you won't help us out of the goodness of your heart and helping your neighbor, loving your neighbor, then do it out of your national security interest or your financial self-interest. Case in point, we can support the hungry, for example, in Syria for less than 50 cents a day. If that same Syrian ends up, let's say, in Germany, the total support cost is over $70 a day. So in Germany in 5 years, $125 billion to support 1 million refugees. $70 a day or 50 cents a day, which makes more sense. If we don't avert famine now, there will be, let me repeat, there will be destabilization of nations and mass migration, and the cost will be 1,000 times more. It was on this platform, hard to believe, 42 years ago, that Mother Teresa said, "The poor are very wonderful people. The poor are very great people. They can teach us so many beautiful things. The poor give us much more than we give them. They're such strong people living day to day with no food. We have much to learn from them." That is why our motivation to help the poor should go much deeper than self-interest. The poor can teach those of us who live in the wealthy world things that we just can't learn any other way. It was a couple of years ago, I was being interviewed in a major television program in the United States, and as we were finishing the program, taking off the microphone, the interviewer looked at me and he said, "Governor, you've got the greatest job on the planet, saving the lives of millions of people every single day." And I looked at him and I said, "I do. I really do. But I'm going to say something to you that you haven't thought of, and it's going to bother you." And he looked at me with a bewildered look, thinking, what could that be? And I said, "I don't go to bed at night thinking about the children we saved. I go to bed at night weeping over the children we could not save. And when we don't have enough money, nor the access we need, we at the World Food Program have to choose which children eat, which children don't eat, which children live, which children die. How would you like that job?" He looked at me with complete horror. "Oh my God, I've never thought about that." And I said, "Well, we have to think about it every day. And you know what really infuriates you? To think that there's $430 trillion of wealth on earth today, and a single child goes to bed hungry and dies? Please, don't ask us to choose who eats, who doesn't eat, who lives, who dies." So let me close with 4 golden rule action steps on how we can love our neighbors. Number 1, leaders of the world in America and China, Russia, India, the Gulf states, the EU, the UK, and everywhere. We need you to assert your powers and stop these horrible wars. Conflict, violence, war cost the global GDP $15 trillion every single year. We could solve every problem on the planet with that money. Number two, billionaires of the world, give us the $6.6 billion that we need to prevent famine and save 45 million people now. And number three, and then billionaires, give us your creative genius to reinvent the food security system all over the world. Charity is important, but it will never be enough. You know how to revolutionize phones, cars, rockets, retail. Help us revolutionize how the planet eats. And four, let's break down all the divisions of the world the old-fashioned way, by sitting down and breaking bread together. If you're black, with a white person. If you're white, with a black person, an Asian, a Latino. If you're rich, with a poor person. If you're liberal, with a conservative. You get my point. That's the very best way to learn how to be equals, to know your neighbor, and to realize how special and how wonderful and how beautiful every single person on the planet is. In the spirit of Alfred Nobel, as inscribed on this medal, Peace and Brotherhood, for the love of the children of the world, let's feed them all. Thank you.
Your Majesties, Your Royal Highness, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. The democratic peace thesis argues that democracy is an effective defense against war and conflict. Democracies do not go to war against each other, and with only very few exceptions, they go to war at all. The core value of democracy is citizen participation in public life. In addition, it includes a few freedoms, such as freedom of speech and freedom of information. This is a benefit for the individual, but it is in fact a basic prerequisite for democracy itself. Only where there is full freedom of speech and freedom of information can each and every citizen exercise their right to freely express opinions, elect leaders on an informed basis, and be active participants in public debate. For political leaders, it might be irritating and very uncomfortable to be scrutinized in public. But the effect of such scrutiny is increased trust between leaders and the public at large. It is no coincidence that the same countries which score highest on ranking of press freedom in the world also top rankings measuring to what extent people trust their governments. Democracies come in many forms and are never entirely perfect. But it is a fact that citizen participation and the possibility of free elections and free information reduce friction among people within a state and between states. In an ideal world, democracy and basic freedoms should be available to all. Unfortunately, that is not the state of world affairs. Democracy is under pressure and in retreat. Freedom of information and freedom of speech are on the decline all over the world. Sadly, we also see democracies abandoning democratic ideals and sliding towards authoritarianism. War and conflict do not thrive in an atmosphere where propaganda might be ridiculed and where leaders are held accountable by the public. The planning of wars and genocide has never taken place in the limelight of the public eye. Bringing the story to the public may in itself prevent war. A free fact-based press is in the front line of efforts to defend the values of democracy, freedom of speech and information. The role of the press is to reveal aggression and abuse of power, thereby contributing to peace. This work is carried out unremittingly by journalists every day all over the world. The Nobel Peace Prize for 2021 has been awarded to two outstanding representatives of the press, Maria Ressa, working in the Philippines, and Dmitry Muratov, working in the Russian Federation. The Norwegian Nobel Committee wishes to focus on the link between peace and security on the one hand, and a free fact-based press that defends freedom of information and freedom of speech on the other hand. Maria Ressa uses freedom of expression to expose abuse of power, use of violence, and growing authoritarianism in her native country, the Philippines. In 2012, she co-founded Rappler, an online news website for investigative journalism, of which she still is the president. Maria Ressa is a fearless defender of freedom of expression. Rappler has focused critical attention on the Duterte regime's controversial, murderous anti-drug campaign. The campaign has death tolls so high that it resembles a civil war. Ms. Ressa and Rappler have also documented how social media is used to spread fake news, harass opponents, and manipulate public discourse. Dmitry Muratov stands out as one of the most prominent defenders of freedom of speech in Russia today. He is one of the founders of Novaya Gazeta and has been its editor-in-chief since 1995. Novaya Gazeta is the most independent newspaper in Russia today, with a fundamental critical attitude towards power. The newspaper's fact-based journalism and professional integrity made it an important source of information on aspects of Russian society rarely mentioned by other media. Both laureates have been the object of ridicule, harassment, threats, and violence as a result of their work. Being a journalist is for many a high-risk occupation. 6 journalists working for Novaya Gazeta have been killed. In the Philippines, a total of 89 journalists have died in the line of duty since 1992. And Maria Ressa has received death threats on public television from the Filipino president. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all international press organizations that document and report on the working conditions for journalists. Journalism is not always used to promote truth and peace. Sometimes the press is part of the problem, such as when helping to spread propaganda and fake news. In Rwanda, the genocide started with radio broadcasts containing hate speech against Tutsis. Hate speech, fake news, and polarized public discourse are a problem in all nations today. With this year's award, the Norwegian Nobel Committee wishes to underscore the importance of free speech and a free press in combating the destructive developments in our societies. Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov are participants in a war where the written word is the weapon, where truth is their goal, and every exposure of misuse of power is their victory. We need to stand on their side and support every journalist in every part of the world working for the same goals. By doing so, we are defending freedom of speech and democracy and giving peace a chance. There is a clear connection between this year's Nobel Peace Prize and the 1935 Peace Prize awarded to Karl von Ossietzky for having exposed the illegal rearmament of the German Air Force. Mr. Ossietzky was the editor of the German weekly magazine Die Weltbühne, but later perished after harsh treatment in a Nazi concentration camp. The Hitler government refused to allow him to come to Oslo to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. With this year's Peace Prize, the Norwegian Nobel Committee honors the will of Alfred Nobel by identifying freedom of speech as a prerequisite for fostering fraternity between nations, exposing warfare, and promoting disarmament. And now it is my pleasure to call upon the Nobel Peace Prize laureates for 2021 to step forward to receive the diploma and the gold medal. Would you please come forward? I call upon Maria Ressa to deliver her Nobel lecture for 2021. Please take the stage.
Thank you. Your Majesties, Your Royal Highnesses, distinguished members of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you, a representative of every journalist around the world who is forced to sacrifice so much to hold the line, to stay true to our values and mission, to bring you the truth and hold power to account. I remember the brutal dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi, the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, my friend Luz Mely Reyes in Venezuela, Roman Protasevich in Belarus, whose plane was literally hijacked so he could be arrested, Jimmy Lai languishing in a Hong Kong prison, Sunny Shui, who after getting out of more than 7 years in jail, started another news group and now is forced to flee Myanmar. And in my own country, 23-year-old Frenchie May Cumpio, still in prison after nearly 2 years, and just 36 hours ago, the news that my former colleague, Jess Malabanan, was killed with a bullet to his head. There are so many to thank for keeping us safer and working. The Hold the Line coalition of more than 80 global groups defending press freedom and the human rights groups that help us shine the light. There are costs for you as well. At least 63 lawyers, more lawyers have been killed than journalists in the Philippines. At least 63 compared to the 22 journalists murdered after President Rodrigo Duterte took office in 2016. Since then, Karapatan, a member of our Courage on Human Rights Coalition, has had 16 people killed, and Senator Laila de Lima, because she demanded accountability, is serving her 5th year in jail. Or ABS-CBN, our largest broadcaster, a newsroom that I once led, which last year lost its franchise to operate. I helped create a startup, Rappler, turning 10 years old in January. We're getting old. Our attempt to put together two sides of the same coin that shows everything wrong with our world today: the absence of law and democratic vision for the 21st century. That coin represents our information ecosystem, which determines everything else about our world. Journalists, that's one side, the old gatekeepers. The other is technology, with its godlike power, the new gatekeepers. It has allowed the virus of lies to infect each of us, pitting us against each other, bringing out our fears, anger, hate, and setting the stage for the rise of authoritarians and dictators around the world. Our greatest need today is to transform that hate and violence, the toxic sludge that's coursing through our information ecosystem, prioritized by American internet companies that make more money by spreading that hate and triggering the worst in us. Okay, well, that just means we have to work harder. You know, in order to be the good, we have to believe there is good in the world, right? An old t-shirt from Rappler from 2014. I've been a journalist for more than 35 years. I've worked in conflict zones and war zones in Asia, reported on hundreds of disasters. And while I've seen so much bad, I've also documented so much good when people who have nothing offer you what they have. Part of how we at Rappler have survived the last 5 years of government attacks is because of the kindness of strangers. And the reason they help, despite the danger, is because they want to, with little expectation of anything in return. This is the best of who we are, the part of our humanity that makes miracles happen. This is what we lose in a world of fear and violence. You've heard that the last time a working journalist was given this award was in 1936. Awarded in 1935. He was supposed to come and get it in 1936. Karl von Ossietzky never made it to Oslo because he languished in a Nazi concentration camp. So we're here. Hopefully a little bit ahead, we are both here. By giving this to journalists today, thank you, the Nobel Committee is signaling a similar historical moment, another existential point for democracy. Dmitry and I are lucky because we can speak to you now. Yay for court approvals. But there are so many more journalists persecuted in the shadows with neither exposure nor support, and governments are doubling down with impunity. The accelerant is technology, when creative destruction takes new meaning. You've heard from David, we are standing on the rubble of the world that was, and we must have the foresight and courage to imagine what might happen if we don't act now, and instead, please, create the world as it should be, more compassionate, more equal, more sustainable. To do that, please ask yourself the same question we at Rappler had to confront 5 years ago. What are you willing to sacrifice for the truth? I'll tell you how I lived my way into the answer in 3 points. First, my context and how these attacks shaped me. Second, by the problem we all face. And finally, finding the solution, because we must. In less than 2 years, the Philippine government filed 10 arrest warrants against me. I've had to post bail 10 times just to do my job. Last year, I and a former colleague were convicted of cyber libel for a story we published 8 years earlier at a time the law we allegedly violated didn't even exist. All told, the charges I faced could send me to jail for about 100 years. But the more I was attacked for my journalism, the more resolute I became. I had firsthand evidence of abuse of power. What was meant to intimidate me and Rappler only strengthened us. At the core of journalism is a code of honor, and mine is layered on different worlds, from how I grew up, the golden rule, what's right and wrong, from college and the honor code I learned there, and my time as a reporter, and the code of standards and ethics I learned and helped write. Add to that the Filipino idea of utang na loob, literally the debt from within. At its best, it's a system of paying it forward. Truth and ethical honor intersected like an arrow into this moment where hate, lies, and divisiveness thrive. As only the 18th woman to receive this prize, I need to tell you how gendered disinformation is a new threat and is taking a significant toll on the mental health and physical safety of women, girls, trans, and LGBTQ people all around the world. Women journalists are at the epicenter of risk. This pandemic of misogyny and hatred needs to be tackled now. Even there, though, we can find strength. After all, you don't really know who you are until you're forced to fight for it. Now let me pull out so we're clear about the problem we all face and how we got here. The attacks against us in Rappler began 5 years ago when we demanded an end to impunity on two fronts: Rodrigo Duterte's drug war and Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook. Today it has only gotten worse, and Silicon Valley's sins came home to roost in the United States on January 6th with mob violence on Capitol Hill. What happens on social media doesn't stay on social media. Online violence is real-world violence. Social media is a deadly game for power and money, what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, extracting our private lives for outsized corporate gain, our personal experiences sucked into a database, organized by AI, then sold to the highest bidder. Highly profitable micro-targeting operations are engineered to structurally undermine human will. I've repeatedly called it a behavior modification system in which we are all Pavlov's dogs, experimented on in real time with disastrous consequences in countries like mine, Myanmar, India, Sri Lanka, so many more. These destructive corporations have siphoned money away from news organizations, and now they pose a foundational threat to markets and elections. Facebook is the world's largest distributor of news, and yet studies have shown that lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further than facts. These American companies controlling our global information ecosystem are biased against facts, biased against journalists. They are by design dividing us and radicalizing us. I've said this repeatedly over the last 5 years. Without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without trust, we have no shared reality, no democracy, and it becomes impossible to deal with the existential problems of our times: climate, coronavirus, now the battle for truth. When I first was arrested in 2019, the officer said, "Ma'am, trabaho lang po." "Ma'am, I'm only doing my job." Then he lowered his voice to almost a whisper as he read my Miranda rights. He was really uncomfortable, and I almost felt sorry for him, except he was arresting me because I'm a journalist. This officer was a tool of power and an example of how a good man can turn evil and how great atrocities happen. Hannah Arendt wrote about the banality of evil when describing men who carried out the orders of Hitler. how career-oriented bureaucrats can act without conscience because they justify what they're doing because they're only following orders. This is how a nation and a world loses its soul. You have to know what values you're fighting for. You have to draw the lines early, but if you haven't done so, please do it now. Where on this side you're good, this side you're evil. Some governments may be lost causes, and if you're working in tech, I'm talking to you. How can you have election integrity if you don't have integrity of facts? That's the problem facing countries with elections next year. Among them, Brazil, Hungary, France, the United States, and my Philippines, where we are at a do-or-die moment with presidential elections on May 9th. 35 years after the People Power Revolt ousted Ferdinand Marcos and forced his family into exile, his son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., is the front runner for president. And he has built an extensive disinformation network on social media, which Rappler exposed in 2019. It's literally changing history in front of our eyes. To show how disinformation is both a local and global problem, take the Chinese information operations taken down by Facebook in September 2020, a year ago. It was creating fake accounts using AI-generated photos for the US elections, polishing the image of the Marcoses in the Philippines, campaigning for the daughter of Duterte, of President Duterte, and attacking me and Rappler. Chinese information operations. So what are we going to do? An invisible atom bomb has exploded in our information ecosystem, and the world must act as it did after Hiroshima. Like that time, we need to create new institutions like the United Nations and new codes stating our values like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to prevent humanity from doing its worst. It's an arms race in our information ecosystem. To stop that requires a multilateral approach that all of us must be part of. It begins by restoring facts. We need information ecosystems that live and die by facts. We do this by shifting social priorities to rebuild journalism for the 21st century while regulating and outlawing the surveillance economics that profit from hate and lies. We need to help independent journalism survive. First, by giving greater protection to journalists and standing up against states which target journalists. Then we need to address the advertising model of journalism. This is part of the reason that I agreed to co-chair the International Fund for Public Interest Media, which is trying to raise money from overseas development assistance funds. Right now, while journalists are under attack on every front, only 0.3% of ODA funds is spent on journalism. If we nudge that to just 1%, we can raise $1 billion a year for news organizations. That will be crucial for the Global South. Journalists must embrace technology. That's why, with the help of Google News Initiative, Rappler rolled out a new platform 2 weeks ago designed to build communities of action. It won't be as viral as what the tech platforms built, but the North Star is not profit alone. It is facts, truth, and trust. Now for legislation. Thanks to the EU for taking leadership with its Democracy Action Plan. For the US, reform or revoke Section 230, the law that treats social media platforms like utilities. It's not a comprehensive solution, but it gets the ball rolling. Because these platforms put their thumbs on the scale of distribution. So while the public debate is here, down here on content moderation downstream, the real sleight of hand happens further upstream, where algorithms of amplification, algorithms of distribution have been programmed by humans with coded bias. Their editorial agenda is profit-driven, carried out by machines at scale. The impact is global, with cheap armies on social media rolling back democracy, tearing it down in 81 countries around the world. That impunity must stop. Democracy has become a woman-to-woman, man-to-man defense of our values. We're at a sliding door moment where we can continue down the path we're on and descend further into fascism. Or we can choose to fight for a better world. To do that, please ask yourself, what are you willing to sacrifice for the truth? I didn't know if I was going to be here today. Every day, I live with the real threat of spending the rest of my life in jail because I'm a journalist. When I go home, I have no idea what the future holds, but it's worth the risk. The destruction has already happened. Now it's time to build, to create the world we want. So please, with me, just close your eyes for just a moment and imagine the world as it should be. A world of peace, trust, and empathy, bringing out the best that we can be. Open your eyes. Now go. We have to make it happen. Please, let's hold the line together. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call upon Dmitry Muratov to come forward and give his Nobel lecture for 2021. Please take the floor.
Ваше Величество, Ваше Королевское Высочество, уважаемые члены Нобелевского комитета, уважаемые гости. У всех наушники есть, да? Утром 8 октября мне позвонила мама, спросила, что новенького. Говорю: мама, вот Нобелевскую премию получили. И это, говорит, хорошо, а что еще новенького? Сейчас, мама, я тебе все расскажу. Я убежден, что свобода убеждений, наряду с другими гражданскими свободами, является основой прогресса. Я защищаю тезис об определяющем значении гражданской и политической свобод в формировании судеб человечества. Я убежден, что международное доверие, разоружение и безопасность немыслимы без открытости общества, свободы информации, убеждений, гласности. Мир, прогресс, права человека, мир, прогресс, права человека. Эти три цели неразрывно связаны. Это из Нобелевской речи академика Андрея Сахарова, гражданина Земли, великого мыслителя. И эту речь прямо здесь, в этом городе, в четверг, 11 декабря 1975 года, прочитала его жена Елена Боннер. И вот я посчитал необходимым, чтобы слова Сахарова прозвучали здесь второй раз. в этом знаменитом на весь мир зале. Это очень важно для нас, это очень важно для меня. Почему? Мир разлюбил демократию. Мир разочаровался в правящих элитах. Мир потянулся к диктатуре. Возникла иллюзия, что прогресса можно достичь технологиями и насилием, а не соблюдением прав и свобод человека. Такой вот прогресс без свободы, такое вот молоко без коровы. Диктатуры обеспечили себе упрощенный доступ к насилию. У нас в стране, и не только у нас, популярна мысль: те политики, которые избегают крови, слабые люди, а вот угрожать миру войной – это долг настоящих патриотов. Власть активно продает идею войны. Под влиянием агрессивного маркетинга войны люди привыкают к мысли о ее допустимости. Правительство и близкие к ним пропагандисты несут всю полноту ответственности за милитаристскую риторику на государственных телевизионных каналах. Но я видел и другие телевизоры, которые показывали честные и страшные картины. Во время Чеченской войны на одном из вокзалов стояли на рельсах 5 белых вагонов-холодильников. Возле них круглосуточно была охрана. Это были морги. Морги на колесах. 124-й лаборатории Министерства обороны. В этих рефрижераторах хранились неопознанные тела солдат и офицеров. У многих уже не было лиц от прямых попаданий или пыток. Начальник лаборатории, капитан первого ранга Щербаков, делал все, чтобы не осталось безымянных солдат. И поэтому в небольшом домике рядом с этими вагонами стоял телевизор. А в креслах, как в зале ожидания, сидели матери и отцы пропавших без вести солдат, а оператор с видеокамерой транслировал на экран перед ними одно за другим изображение тел. Одно за другим 458 раз. Столько военных лежали тогда в этих вагонах при минус 15 градусов, лежали в своем последнем поезде, пришедшем по маршруту «Война, смерть». Матери, которые по много месяцев искали в горах и ущельях Чечни своих мальчиков, увидев на экране лицо своего мертвого сына, кричали: «Это не он! Это не он!» А это был он. Нынешние наши идеологи снова продвигают идеи смерти за Родину, а не жизни за Родину. Не дадим снова себя обмануть. Вспомним про то, что показывал другой телевизор в той маленькой комнате возле морга на колесах. Гибридные боевые действия. Трагическая, безобразная, преступная история с Боингом MH17. Они разрушили отношения России и Украины. Я не знаю, сумеет ли последующее поколение политиков их восстановить. Тем более в больных головах геополитиков война России и Украины перестает казаться невозможной. Но я знаю, войны заканчиваются с опознанием солдат и обмена пленными. На Чеченской войне «Новая газета» и наш обозреватель майор Измайлов смогли освободить из плена 174 человека. Если сейчас, в моем новом качестве, я и газета сможем что-то сделать для возвращения еще живых пленных по домам, скажите, я готов. Я хочу сейчас вспомнить еще одного человека, получившего премию мира в Осло в 1990 году. Москва, Кремль, 18 апреля 1988 года, идет заседание Политбюро. Один из советских министров требует оставить войска в Афганистане. Михаил Горбачев жестко прерывает его. Прекрати свой ястребиный клёкот. Прекратить ястребиный клёкот. Чем не современная программа для политики и журналистики наладить жизнь без похоронок? Это сложно. В центре Европы к событиям на востоке Украины добавилась игра на крови белорусского президента Лукашенко. Его военные гонят под автоматами беженцев с Ближнего Востока на цепи автоматчиков, охраняющих границы Евросоюза. Стороны обвиняют друг друга, а обезумевшие люди мечутся буквально между двух огней. Мы журналисты, наша работа понятна. Разделять факт и ложь. Новое поколение журналистов-профессионалов умеет расследовать события с использованием больших данных, с информационными базами. Мы изучили их, и мы нашли, чьи борта доставляют беженцев в точку этого конфликта. Только факты. Белорусские самолеты увеличили рейсы в Минск с Ближнего Востока осенью этого года более чем в 4 раза. Смотрите, 6 рейсов было в августе-ноябре 2020 года и 27 рейсов в этом году, в те же месяцы этого года. 4,5 тысячи человек привезла белорусская компания для возможного прорыва границы в этом году. А только 600 туристов было в прошлом. Еще 6 тысяч беженцев, впервые такое количество, доставила авиакомпания из Ирака. Вот так, как выяснили журналисты, как мы сумели расследовать, организуются вооруженные провокации и конфликты, ведущие к войне. Мы, журналисты, выяснили, как это устроено, мы сделали свою работу. Дальше дело политиков. Занимайтесь. Народ для государства или государство для народа? Это главный конфликт сегодня. Этот конфликт Сталин решал массовыми репрессиями. Но практика пыток в тюрьмах и во время следствия сохранилась в современной России. Жестокое обращение, изнасилование, ужасные условия содержания, запрет на свидание, запрет на звонок матери в день ее рождения, бесконечное продление сроков содержания под стражей. До суда за решетку отправляют людей с тяжелыми заболеваниями, с 3 операциями за последний год. У них в заложниках больные дети, и от них требуют признания вины без предъявления доказательств. Уголовные дела по фальшивым обвинениям часто носят политический характер. Оппозиционного политика Алексея Навального держат в лагере по ложному доносу российского директора крупнейшей парфюмерной компании из Франции. Заявление директор написал, но даже в суд не был вызван и потерпевшим себя не считает, а Навальный по его доносу сидит. Сама же парфюмерная компания предпочла отойти в сторону, надеясь, что запах этого дела не повредит аромату ее продукции. Увы, мы все чаще слышим о пытках, применяемых к заключенным и задержанной. Людей пытают, чтобы сломить, чтобы увеличить жестокость наказания за рамками приговора. Это дикость. Я выступаю сейчас и здесь с инициативой создания Международного трибунала против пыток, задача которого — собирать данные о применении пыток в разных частях света и государствах, установить палачей и их хозяев, причастных к подобным преступлениям. Надеюсь, конечно, в первую очередь на журналистов-расследователей со всего света. Пытки должны быть признаны тяжелейшим преступлением против личности. Кстати, «Новая газета» продолжает век Digital выходить и на бумаге, для того, чтобы нас могли читать и в тюрьмах. В тюрьмах нет интернета. Две тенденции борются сейчас у нас в России. С одной стороны, президент России Владимир Путин помогает установить памятник к столетию академика Сахарова. С другой стороны, в нашей же стране Генеральная прокуратура требует ликвидировать Международное общество «Мемориал». «Мемориал» занимается реабилитацией жертв сталинских репрессий, а обвиняют его прокуроры в нарушении прав человека. А может быть, потому что недавно у нас в стране ФСБ снова засекретила имена сталинских следователей и палачей. Напомню, мемориал-то создавал Сахаров. Может быть, памятник мертвому Сахарову безопаснее, чем его живой действующий проект. Мемориал не враг народа. Мемориал друг народа. Мемориал надо сохранять. Мы, конечно, понимаем, это премия всему профессиональному сообществу настоящих журналистов. Мои коллеги разоблачали отмывание денег, вернули в бюджет миллиарды украденных рублей, вскрывали офшоры, останавливали вырубки сибирских лесов. Государство поддержало усилия «Новой газеты», «Эхо Москвы», «Дождя» и других медиа по лечению детей, больных редкими заболеваниями, для которых нужны самые дорогие лекарства в мире. Я, кстати, надеюсь, что представителями фарминдустрии, от которых зависят судьбы детей и молодых взрослых с орфанными заболеваниями, в том числе со спинально-мышечной атрофией, сядут с нами за круглый стол. Может, они сделают диагностику, скрининг, раннюю диагностику, скрининг и лекарства более доступными. Может быть, богатый мир найдет деньги на несколько тысяч детей, в которых пока еще есть жизнь. Мы эту премию передаем на помощь больным людям и поддержку независимой журналистики. Но журналистика в России сейчас переживает темные времена. За несколько последних месяцев более 100 журналистов, медиа, правозащитников и НКО получили статус иностранных агентов. В России это значит одно – враг народа. Многие наши коллеги остались без работы. Кто-то вынужден уехать из страны. У человека отбирают привычную жизнь на неизвестное время, а может быть, отбирают навсегда. Такое случалось в нашей истории. В следующем году будет 100 лет, как 29 сентября из Санкт-Петербурга отошел в Германию в Поркштеттен философский пароход. Очередной рейс, на котором большевики выгнали из России 300 виднейших представителей интеллектуальной элиты. На пароходе обербургермайстер Хакен отправили в изгнание будущего изобретателя вертолетов Сикорского, создателя телевидения Зворыкина, философов Франка, Ильина, Петерима Сорокина, а крупнейший мыслитель Николай Бердяев тоже был там. Как и всем, ему разрешили взять пижаму, 2 рубашки, 2 пары носков и зимнее пальто. Так Родина попрощалась со своими великими гражданами. Вещи оставляйте, а мозги забирайте с собой. С журналистами и правозащитниками картина сейчас повторяется. Только теперь вместо философского парохода улетает журналистский самолет. Это метафора, конечно, но десятки представителей нашей профессии покидают Россию. А кого-то лишили и такой возможности. Архана Джемаля, Кирилла Радченко, Александра Расторгуева, российских журналистов, безжалостно расстреляли в Центральной Африканской Республике, куда они приехали расследовать деятельность одной из российских частных военных компаний. Вдова Архана, Ира Гордиенко, работает у нас в «Новой газете». С момента убийства 30 июня 2018 года она разоблачает ложь официального следствия. Вот вам только одна деталь. Бесценное вещественное доказательство. Одежда погибших была просто сожжена полицейскими Центральной Африканской Республики. Никаких результатов не добилось и российское следствие, и международное тоже. Генсек ООН Антонио Гутерриш обещал содействовать в расследовании. Он, наверное, забыл об этом. Вот я напоминаю. Меня, конечно, могут спросить, а зачем ваши коллеги туда полезли? А чтобы свидетельствовать, чтобы доказать, чтобы лично увидеть, чтобы, как сказал великий военный фотограф Роберт Капа, если тебе твой снимок не нравится, значит, ты был недостаточно близко. А разве не страшно? Самый частый вопрос моим коллегам. А это их миссия. Когда правительства все время улучшают прошлое, журналисты пытаются улучшить будущее. Поэтому это премия всей настоящей журналистики. Это премия моим погибшим коллегам и друзьям из «Новой газеты» Игорю Домникову, Юрию Щекочихину, Анне Политковской, Насте Бабуровой, Стасу Маркелову, Наташе Истемировой. Это премия и живым моим коллегам, сообществу, которое продолжает выполнять профессиональный долг. За день до того, как объявили о этой награде, мы отметили 15 лет со дня убийства Ани Политковской. Убийцы получили справедливые приговоры, но заказчик преступления не найден, а срок давности истек. Официально заявляю, редакция «Новой газеты» этот срок давности не признает. В русском и английском, и в других языках есть поговорка «собака лает, а караван идет». «The dog barks, but the caravan goes on». Ее трактуют так. Движению каравана вперед ничто не помешает. Иногда власть так пренебрежительно говорит о журналистах. Они лают, но ни на что не влияют. Я недавно узнал, что смысл поговорки имеет противоположное значение. Караван идет вперед, потому что собаки лают, рычат и кидаются на хищников в горах и пустынях. И движение вперед возможно только, когда они сопровождают караван. Да, мы рычим и кусаем, у нас клыки и хватка, но мы – условия движения, мы – антидот от тирании. Я хотел сэкономить время, не знаю, получилось ли, но я прошу вас встать и почтить минутой молчания наших с Марией коллег-репортеров, отдавших жизни за эту профессию, и поддержим тех, кто подвергается преследованиям. Я хочу, чтобы журналисты умирали старыми. Спасибо огромное.
Serce was